This is The Corner Series, a McGuireWoods series exploring business and legal issues prevalent in today's private equity industry. Tune in with McGuireWoods partner Geoff Cockrell as he and specialists share real-world insight to help enhance your knowledge.
Thank you for joining another episode of The Corner Series. I'm your host, Geoff Cockrell, a partner at McGuireWoods. Here at The Corner Series, we try to bring together deal makers and thought leaders at the intersection of private equity investing and healthcare and life sciences. And some of those interactions connect with kind of operations at some of these companies. Today, I'm joined by Matt Stekier, a principal at Plante Moran in their management consulting group, where he works on supply chain and production. And Matt works with a bunch of different companies, helping them optimize their performance. But Matt, if you could give an introduction of yourself and Plante Moran, and in particular, its management consulting group.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Geoff. Glad to be here. Matt Stekier, Principal Supply Chain and Consulting, as Geoff said. Plante Moran is a tax audit and consulting firm. Plante Moran's management consulting group provides all the basic management consulting solutions you would expect from a tax and audit company, along with a large IT practice, transaction advisory services that work along with the private equity groups to help them make their transactions, and then our supply chain and operations team, which interacts quite a bit with private equity groups and within the medical device and healthcare industry. Lots of issues there to solve, and we enjoy providing solutions. Been doing this for a little more than 25 years now, so I can consider myself a seasoned veteran.
In kind of healthcare and life science investing, where some of your expertise connects to clients that I work with, tends to be, as you noted, on kind of the medical device and product side. If you could kind of maybe chart out some of the kind of high level issue areas, and then we can delve into them. So a company that's manufacturing medical devices, what are some of the kind of categorical areas where they need improvement?
A lot of what we get involved with have to do with either companies that are struggling operationally, where they need to just improve their throughput, get more out of what they have, as well as with the inventory management side of things, trying to help companies not have too much capital tied up with unneeded inventory. A lot in the space of doing due diligence. More companies now, more private equity groups are getting involved with doing more operation diligence, supply chain diligence, and IT diligence.
And let's pick one of those categories of supply chain diligence in the context of an acquisition. What are some of the problems specifically that you would encounter in a target?
Some of the problems we'll encounter have to do with the target not really having a good data set or a good feel for their supply chain risks and vulnerabilities. So with a company targeting somebody for acquisition, they want to understand, where are my risks? And a lot of the companies that we're encountering don't know how to quantify those or don't have visibility to those. So we'll go in and do a quick diagnostic, kind of kick the tires, so to speak, to understand where these vulnerabilities may lie and help the acquiring private equity group understand where they might have to infuse some cash to get just the same volumes and throughput for the company that they currently get, let alone what is it going to take to help grow this company, or how can they bolt it on to a set of portfolio companies they already have to get to that 1 + 1 = 3 sort of situation.
Maybe diving down a little bit further, what might some of those vulnerabilities actually look like?
Some of them some of those will lie in the products that they purchase. So the component products that they purchase, if a company doesn't realize they have a lot of their spend tied up with at-risk suppliers, or if they're buying things from a part of the world that has a lot of geopolitical tensions and or risks involved, depending on the type of materials that are being bought for the products that are being made. So if there's a particular design or technology that the target company has that really provides that value and why somebody may want to buy this company, if the technology or if the components come from a risky part of the world or from a singular supplier, if there's a bad relationship with that company, they may purchase this company and what they were hoping to get is no longer available because the company that they had a poor relationship with took their design or decides that they don't have capacity anymore to supply a particular component.
Do those issues usually kind of create binary outcome risks that can be a no-go on a deal, or is it usually more an issue where it's just going to cost you more money to achieve what you thought you could achieve with less money?
I think like with most diligent activities, it highlights where the risks are, and then the acquiring company can decide, is this risk something that we should take seriously and potentially look somewhere else for some other technology or some other product to acquire versus it's acceptable, we've realized this risk before, or we have mitigation plans that can help resolve this before it realizes itself. So we have worked with companies where the identified risks are just too much, or there's a potential investment that really makes the acquisition less attractive financially because of what we uncovered during the supply chain and ops diligence.
So we talked a little bit about kind of front end diligence of a target that only covers some of the challenges that a company could face. Often the challenges come in kind of post closing integration. What are some of the challenges you find folks encountering on that front?
Yeah, that's a great question because after the acquisition has been made, that's when the real work starts. So we're seeing companies needing assistance either on the integration side of things when they want to start bolting on whatever they purchased onto their existing portfolio companies, or on the flip side of that is then when they're looking to divest, where they maybe are willing to sell or want to take part of what they have and sell off, where okay, operationally, are we set? Are we able to show that the value has been created with this company? So operationally, have we done what we needed to do to add the value? Are we getting more out of what we have? Do we understand the processes that are in place? So throughout that kind of series of after the acquisition, the integration part is okay, let's make sure that we have common processes. Let's make sure we have an integrated way of doing things. So it's, am I doing the same thing at both companies? Do we act like one company, or are we still acting like two companies just with one owner? In that instance, when you have those where there hasn't been a full integration, you don't get the full value. You don't realize the synergies that you expected to realize. So on that front end part of integration, we can help identify and realize those synergies that were part of the deal that made it attractive. On the back end of that, on the divestiture side, it's okay, are we ready to split or are we ready to sell? And then we get in there and maybe it's 1 or 2 years prior to sell and really squeeze out as much EBITDA out of operations as we can to make those numbers the most attractive to a prospective buyer.
How much variation do you encounter in some of these things? I mean, at some level, I would think that as you encounter companies of a certain scale, they're much more likely to have more of their operations buttoned up. Is that true, or is there just an immense amount of variation that you encounter?
You know, that's interesting because regardless of industry and regardless of size of company, every situation we encounter tends to be a little different. You are correct in the one aspect in saying companies of a certain size or in a certain industry are going to be at, say, X, but at what variation of X are they going to be? There's always a few notches up where some companies are good or a few notches down where some companies are bad. The interesting thing is we've encountered very large companies, $2-3 billion companies, where we would expect them to have their operations buttoned up. And you walk in and the reason that they're operating where they're at is purely because of volume, not because of they have great processes. Whereas some smaller companies where you might think that they're less sophisticated, they actually have great process documentation. They have great repeatability in their processes. So it does vary, which is why it's important to get in there and understand it, because you can't just take some assumptions and run with them, because you get too far down the road and then a problem pops up, and now it could risk part of the transaction, either the future transaction or part of the existing of what's happening. Some other company comes in to do some diligence and they uncover some areas that you could have cleaned up that you didn't realize because you had a blind spot.
Is your typical engagement with, say, a platform, not in the context of an acquisition, but if you're brought in, is your typical engagement tend to be episodic, or do you become a longer term embedded part of that organization? What does that sort of look like?
With larger clients, it's going to be more of an ongoing relationship because Plante Moran can offer so many different services where we may be helping them with supply chain and ops 1 month, a couple months down the road, we're helping them institute some new technologies. Whereas some of the smaller companies, they may not be able to spend the money they need to on the consulting services. So we try to figure out how can we give the best bang for the buck at the budget that they can afford. So we find that when we're able to have a more long-lasting relationship with our clients, the value exponentially grows. The more we're able to work with them, the more we're able to grow with them, because there's no ramp up curve when we bring in a new team for a new discipline to come in and do a second or third project. There's already that knowledge there. So the team hits the ground running as opposed to the one-off projects.
We talked a little bit about kind of supply chain issues. Another area where folks often have difficulty is in kind of navigating inventory questions. What are some of the hot topics that you are often encountering in terms of inventory management?
Right now with inventory management, there's a couple areas that are really hot. One of them has to do with where the product is coming from. There's a lot of activity with nearshoring or reshoring, which a lot of people have been speaking of over the last few years. People are trying to shorten their supply chain. It used to be an automatic, if you were able to outsource to a particular part of the world, there would be a cost savings. There's now the supply chain risks that are being realized that are making these business cases to bring things back into the historic NAFTA region. I think it's USMCA now, where that business case to bring it back is easily made when you take into account some of these expedite or some of these production shutdowns that happen, because ocean transportation now has become very unpredictable. On the West Coast, last year or 2 years ago, we had those West Coast port where there was 55, 60 ships at any time waiting to get unloaded. The time that it took to get your product from your supplier to your manufacturing or distribution facility grew to the point where there were stockouts. And depending on the product that you were trying to sell or provide, that stockout meant serious health potential consequences and or your customers going to other suppliers to get what they need. On the East Coast side, we recently had that potential port strike. And then a few years earlier, we had the ship turn sideways in the Suez Canal. Getting product from other parts of the world is now extremely unpredictable. There's any number of geopolitical risks we could also add into this mix, where having your product made in Canada, Mexico, or the United States is potentially cost neutral and or cost benefit when you take into these potential where if I have to fly one plane from Southeast Asia into central US, that blew all of the profit margin for last year and next year with that one flight. So that part of inventory is really where people are making strategic decisions and trying to understand, where are my costs going to go from that? Do I need to find offsetting cost savings, or is this a cost neutral move? The other side of inventory that has become very challenging has to do just with inventory management. And this kind of bleeds into, I believe, some of the labor shortages that have been going around the United States for a while. And that is, I'm not sure what I have in inventory as much as I used to, where my system says one number, but my physical inventory says a number. There's any number of reasons why those become off balance. Some of them are process, Some of them are systems. Some of them are actually just people who don't know what they should be doing. So those are the two areas where inventory has become a real challenge. And what started happening a few years ago, people just started buying lots of inventory because of the unpredictability and because they weren't sure what they had. Well, what ended up happening was people ended up with inventory that became obsolete, or they had so much capital tied up in inventory that cash flow started to become an issue. Well, you can't operate without cash. That's great that you have a warehouse full of inventory, but if you can't pay your bills, your company's in trouble. So it was a real delicate balance now that companies are trying to hit on how much should I plan for, how should I plan for it, and then when should I buy, how much should I buy, and where should I place it throughout the United States based on my customer spread, depending on how large and how small you are. Some larger companies may have many distribution centers around the country, and if then becomes a problem of balancing inventory based on consumption. If I have too much inventory at one location, now I'm shipping it across country. It's great that I had all of that inventory, but now I'm spending extra money on transportation because I have to ship it back across country to get to the customer that needs it. So we're seeing lots of our clients ask for help in that aspect.
How does that request come in? Are you usually being engaged in the context of a specific narrow problem, or how do they usually ask you for help?
I think what happens is that companies realize that they're starting to have those cash flow issues where they have too much inventory, but they're still experiencing back orders, and they don't understand where to start with how to correct that problem. So we'll get called up by our clients. We'll start having the conversation about inventory, and we just start asking questions. We get into how much inventory do you have? How much inventory do you need? When you start talking about money and start talking about too much inventory, but still missing sales, sometimes the operational teams just can't figure out why that's happening. So we'll come in and do a diagnostic. And what we end up doing is we start with the planning process and start at the very beginning to help these clients understand where do we start this process at and what's the best way of doing it. It's a strategic process. So when you don't get the automatic benefit, when you start doing something that's going to benefit you months down the road, sometimes companies have a hard time keeping that process going or getting the urgency for people to participate in that, because some people are really just focused on the day to day. They're really working in the business instead of on the business.
For the management consulting work that you do, is the challenge that most of your clients are facing, is it difficulty kind of conceiving of the solution or identifying cleanly the problem? Or is the challenge they are more likely to have kind of execution, that they just don't have the bandwidth to get from point A to point B? Which of those are your kind of greatest assistance to a company?
Another great question, but I think you spelled out the answer, because it's all of the above, just because every organization kind of is different in terms of how they operate, what level of maturity they have in their process, and then the level of talent that they have within those functional areas. Some companies don't understand the problem, so they need someone to come in and help them figure out and do the diagnostic. Some companies will have an understanding of the problem, but not have the bandwidth of their existing manpower to implement a fix. Some companies know it, they have the bandwidth, but then for whatever reason, it's not taken. The execution of the solution doesn't take. We typically get involved with the first part of it, the diagnostic and or the manpower side. When companies understand their issues, they're typically able to kind of force that solution through, and they don't like to bring people in at that point. So I think the value that we bring is helping understand what the root causes that are driving their issues, and then providing them with the roadmap to kind of help them dig out. It becomes critically important that this is a quick process and that this is a cost-effective process, because companies don't like to spend money on consultants. However, if they're losing money, if they're losing customers, they have to do something to stop that bleeding.
Is the cost of engaging someone like you guys, does it tend to be priced based on kind of the actual savings achieved, or is it more kind of incremental, like a lawyer, like I might charge? What does the cost of that look like?
Typically, it's a fixed fee or a fee range, not contingent on the solution that gets implemented. There are some companies out there that will work on a contingency fee if they specialize in sourcing, and they're going to say, if you turn over all of your spend data to me, I'll find X amount of savings and I'll take a particular percent of that. Typically, it's a fee range based on the amount of effort we estimate. And it really is flexed up and down based on the size of the company and the challenge that company is having.
So last question, Matt. It's always an evolving landscape of what the issues and solutions are. Looking forward, where do you see things going in this arena?
It feels as though companies are doing the hold longer. Private equity groups are holding a little bit longer. And what that ends up doing is that ends up leaving time to show where issues may start to rise their heads up and need to be fixed. I think from a supply chain and operations lens, I think that the future is always unpredictable, but there's going to be supply chain disruptions out there. I think more companies are focusing on trying to do a little bit of more risk management and a little risk mitigation because they're seeing them over the last few years. Risks have been realized and we really need to take this seriously. So I think private equity groups and their portfolio companies are taking risks a lot more seriously and trying to be a little more proactive. On the supply chain and operations side of things, supply chain leaders are trying to get ahead of this front and be more of an asset to their company, where they're bringing risk mitigation actions that actually provide cost savings or that prove their value in terms of the throughput of the overall whatever I'm producing or whatever I'm distributing. So I think looking forward, the companies that have strong supply chain and operations leaders and that do that forward look aren't just worried about how many did I get out today, how many did I get out this week. The ones that are looking forward are the ones that are going to be the most successful in the years to come.
That's certainly consistent with kind of what I'm seeing, in the sense of there was a long period of time where the cost of capital was so inexpensive that you could do well in private equity investing to a certain degree through kind of financial engineering. You're borrowing money pretty cheap. You're buying things at a lower multiple, putting them together with other things and selling them at a higher multiple. And you could do those things without improving operations a lot, if any. And I think those days are gone. So the broader idea that, especially from private equity perspective, of in acquiring these companies, we have to make them materially better than what they were before. You see folks leaning into that. I see private equity folks kind of establishing a lot of company improvement mechanisms that they'll keep at the fund and then make those available to multiple platforms. So definitely leaning into operational improvement as a key to having success in their investments in ways that wasn't completely absent before, but there's certainly a much higher emphasis on.
Completely agree.
We could talk for quite a while, but let's end it there. Getting into some of the nuts and bolts of operations is always fun. Matt, thank you for spending a little time with me. It's been a ton of fun.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on this installment of the Corner Series. To learn more about today's discussion, please email host Geoff Cockrell at gcockrell@McGuireWoods.com. We look forward to hearing from you. This series was recorded and is being made available by McGuireWoods for informational purposes only. By accessing this series, you acknowledge that McGuireWoods makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this installment. The views, information, or opinions expressed are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily reflect those of McGuireWoods. This series should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney in your state and should not be construed as an offer to make or consider any investment or course of action.